Welcome to Calm Countdown, the place where history isn't just written by the victors, it's quietly mumbled by the mediocre. Tonight, we set aside the tales of great conquests, legendary battles, and charismatic rulers. Instead, we're wading ankle-deep into the tepid waters of monarchs, so underwhelming, so magnificently average, that their reigns are remembered mostly for the fact that they happened. These kings didn't inspire revolutions or poetry. They didn't leave grand monuments or unforgettable speeches. They left records, stacks and stacks of records, tax rolls, court minutes, grain inventories, the sort of material that makes archivists nod politely and everyone else reach for the kettle. Over the next 10 episodes, we'll descend through the ranks from mildly unremarkable to the human equivalent of drying paint, and you can decide which one truly earns the crown of the most boring king in history. So, fluff your pillow, adjust your blanket, and prepare to be underwhelmed, in regal style, from boring to snoring, in 10 kings or less. Welcome back to Calm Countdown, the channel that turns the world's most exciting or compelling stories into the world's most reliable sleep aids. Tonight, we're heading to 16th century Spain, a superpower that spanned the globe, commanded oceans, and mined enough gold and silver to pave entire cities. At the center of it all was a man who could turn even empire building into an exercise. In paperwork, Philip II of Spain. Philip wasn't lazy. In fact, he worked harder than most monarchs. But he worked in the way a librarian might work during a hurricane, carefully cataloging events while the building burned. He micromanaged an empire that stretched from South America to the Philippines, oversaw wars that dragged on for decades, and built a palace so large it doubled as his own tomb. He was deeply religious, rigidly organized, and about as interested in charisma as a granite countertop. To his admirers, he was pious, diligent, and disciplined. To his critics, he was inflexible, slow, and dull. Tonight, we're taking you through Philip's life in 5 stages, from his youth to his very beige legacy in the same spirit. He ruled slowly, methodically, and without unnecessary excitement. Philip was born in 1527, the son of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and Isabella of Portugal. This made him heir to an empire that spanned most of Europe and much of the known world. From the start, his education was focused on duty, faith, and governance. He studied languages, law, history, and theology. He learned how to write letters and would eventually write more than anyone could possibly want to read. Military training was included, but Philip's interests clearly leaned to war. The administrative observers noted his serious manner from an early age. He dressed simply, spoke quietly, and carried himself with a solemnity more suited to a monastery than a royal court. Even as a child, he preferred structured activities and seemed uncomfortable with spontaneity. By the time he reached adulthood, Philip had mastered the skills of governance and the art of keeping his personality completely out of sight. When Charles V abdicated in 1556, Philip inherited the Spanish crown, along with territories in Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Unlike other kings who ruled from horseback or led armies into battle, Philip ruled from behind a desk. He preferred written reports to verbal briefings, and he read them all. His ministers often complained about delays in decision-making, but Philip considered careful review his sacred duty. He distrusted delegation. Every matter, large or small, was sent to him for final approval. This made his government extraordinarily centralized and painfully slow. Philip's court reflected his personal style, subdued, formal, and highly religious. Ceremonies were measured, entertainment limited, and humor rare. Foreign visitors described him as dignified but unapproachable, a man who could listen for hours without revealing what he thought. Philip's most famous military venture was the Spanish Armada of 1588, an attempt to invade Protestant England and overthrow Queen Elizabeth I. The plan was ambitious, expensive, and in hindsight, doomed. Delays plagued the fleet from the start. Supplies ran short, commanders hesitated, and the English Navy harassed them up the channel. The final blow came from the weather, which scattered the ships and destroyed much of the force. Philip blamed the defeat on God's will, insisting that the cause was still righteous. In practice, the Armada was a symbol of his cautious, overly controlled approach to warfare, one that lacked the flexibility to adapt when things went wrong. Elsewhere, his wars in the Netherlands dragged on for decades, draining resources without decisive victory. Spain remained a major power, but the cost was high, and the returns limited. Philip saw himself as the defender of Catholicism. His reign coincided with the Counter-Reformation, and he supported the Church with relentless devotion. At home, he reinforced religious orthodoxy, working closely with the Inquisition to root out heresy. Abroad, his military campaigns were often framed as holy causes, whether in France, England, or the Netherlands. This religious focus shaped his foreign policy, often leading him into conflicts that were as much about faith as politics. It also reinforced his conservative approach to governance. Innovation was treated with suspicion, and tradition was elevated above practicality. Philip's personal life reflected the same restraint as his politics. He married 4 times, each match driven by dynastic considerations. His first marriage, to Maria of Portugal, ended with her early death. His second, to Mary I of England, produced no heirs and kept him mostly abroad. His third wife, Elizabeth of Valois, brought a rare hint of warmth to his court before dying young. His final marriage, to Anna of Austria, produced his heir. Philip III. He was a devoted father in his own quiet way, though his relationship with his troubled son Don Carlos ended in tragedy when the prince was imprisoned and died under mysterious circumstances. Philip spent his later years at El Escorial, the massive palace monastery he had built outside Madrid. It served as his residence, his administrative center, and, eventually, his burial place. In his final years, Philip suffered from gout and other ailments, but continued to involve himself in state business. Even bedridden, he insisted on reading reports and dictating responses. He died in 1598 after 42 years on the throne. His reign left Spain powerful, but financially strained, with an empire that was vast but increasingly difficult to manage. Philip II was not a king of dazzling victories or grand speeches. He was a ruler of persistence, detail, and unshakable routine. His legacy is a mix of steadfast governance and missed opportunities, an empire held together by paper, prayer, and sheer endurance. For students of history, he's a reminder that not all power is loud. Sometimes it's quiet, meticulous, and if you're not careful, a little soporific. From all of us here at Calm Countdown, thank you for joining us on this journey through the life of a man who made ruling the world look like the most methodical job in the world. Until next time, sleep well. And now, the next king in our list of the most boring monarchs in history. Number 9 on the countdown of the 10 most boring kings in history. Louis XVI was a ruler who managed to turn a revolution into a slow, painful drift toward the guillotine. Louis XVI of France, welcome back to Calm Countdown, the place where royal drama gets smoothed down into a warm, flat pillow of history. Tonight, we're in pre-revolutionary France, a country of grandeur, elegance, and increasingly loud complaints. At the center is a man born into splendor, but destined to preside over one of history's most spectacular collapses. Louis XVI. Louis wasn't a bad man. In fact, he was often described as kind, gentle, and well-meaning. But he was indecisive, cautious to a fault, and more interested in larks and hunting than in the political crisis brewing under his feet. He inherited the French throne at a time when reform was essential, and instead delivered hesitant half-measures, awkward compromises, and a general sense that the captain wasn't entirely sure how to steer the ship. So settle in, relax, and let's drift through the quiet, hesitant reign of the last king of France before the Revolution. Born in 1754, Louis Auguste was the second son of the Dauphin, heir to Louis XV. His elder brother's death in childhood made Louis the new Dauphin at age 11. His education was thorough but uninspiring. Tutors drilled him in history, geography, languages, and religious instruction. He excelled in hunting, horsemanship, and surprisingly locksmithing, which became a lifelong hobby. Personality-wise, he was shy and reserved. Court observers noted his awkwardness in public and his tendency to avoid confrontation. Even as a boy, he preferred quiet pastimes to lively court life. When his father died in 1765, the shy, bookish teenager moved a step closer to the throne. When Louis XV died in 1774, the 20-year-old Dauphin suddenly became Louis XVI. King of France and Navarre died at 15. Louis married Marie Antoinette, the 14-year-old Archduchess of Austria. The match was meant to cement Franco-Austrian relations, but it came with challenges. The young couple were awkward together, and for several years their marriage remained unconsummated, a fact that became the subject of endless gossip. At court, Marie Antoinette adapted quickly to Versailles, embracing its fashion, gambling, and parties. Louis, by contrast, preferred hunting trips and tinkering with locks. Their personalities rarely aligned, and their public image began to diverge. She was seen as frivolous and extravagant. He was seen as dull and hesitant. Over time, they had 4 children, but the early rumors of their marital difficulties stuck, feeding public perception that the king lacked both vigor and authority. Louis inherited a kingdom drowning in debt from years of war, including France's costly participation in the American Revolution. His finance ministers, notably Turgot Necker, and later Coligny, proposed reforms to reduce spending, modernize taxation, and ease the burden on the poor. Louis agreed in principle, but hesitated in action. He would back a reform one week, withdraw it under noble pressure the next. His inability to commit allowed entrenched interests to block nearly every major financial change. When the Assembly of Notables refused to endorse new taxes, Louis was left with few options. His authority weakened as France's fiscal crisis deepened by 1789. France's finances were so dire that Louis summoned the Estates General, a representative body that hadn't met in 175 years. It was meant to approve new taxes, but instead, it became the stage for a political revolution. The Third Estate, representing the common people, broke away to form the National Assembly, declaring themselves the true voice of France. Louis vacillated between conciliation and force, unwilling or unable to decisively resolve the crisis. His mixed signals emboldened radicals and alienated moderates. By the summer of 1789, the storming of the Bastille signaled that events had moved beyond his control. In 1791, as revolutionary pressures mounted, Louis and his family attempted to flee Paris in disguise, aiming to rally loyalist forces in the east. The plan failed when they were recognized in Varennes and brought back to Paris under guard. The flight destroyed much of the remaining public trust in the king. He was now seen not as a well-meaning but ineffective ruler, but as a potential traitor to the revolution. From this point on, Louis's position was increasingly untenable. The monarchy survived on paper, but real power belonged to the revolutionary government. By 1792, France was at war with Austria and Prussia. The monarchy was suspended, and Louis was arrested. Charged with conspiracy and treason, he faced trial before the National Convention. His calm demeanor at trial did little to sway opinion. The convention found him guilty, and on January 21, 1793, Louis XVI was executed by guillotine in the Place de la Revolution. Accounts say he tried to speak to the crowd before the drums drowned him out. His final words were polite and restrained, fitting for a man whose reign had been defined by quiet hesitancy. Louis XVI's reign was not one of bold reforms or decisive leadership. It was a reign of cautious steps, delayed decisions, and missed opportunities. He was a man caught between old traditions and new demands, unable to fully embrace either. To his supporters, he was a decent man, overwhelmed by circumstances. To his critics, he was the architect of his own downfall. Either way, Louis XVI remains one of history's most reluctant monarchs, a man whose quiet nature could not withstand the noise of revolution. From Calm Countdown, thank you for joining us for another gentle drift through history. May your dreams be peaceful, your decisions timely, and your revolutions strictly theoretical. Moving down to number 8 on our list of the most boring kings in history, we find a monarch who treated ruling like a stubborn refusal to move furniture, introducing Ferdinand VII of Spain. Welcome back to Calm Countdown, where we transform royal upheavals into a soothing hum, perfect for bedtime, background noise, or anyone who finds drama a little too exciting. Tonight's figure is a king who reigned not once, not twice, but 3 separate times, and yet somehow managed to make it feel like nothing much happened at all. A man so committed to reversing progress that he could make a clock tick backwards, slowly. Of course, this is Ferdinand VII of Spain, known at various points as the Desired, and later the Felon King. His reign featured foreign invasions, revolutions, and colonial collapse. And still, his legacy is mostly a list of things he canceled. So if you're ready to drift gently into the 19th century, where wars rage politely in the distance and reforms are put quietly back in their boxes, let's begin. Breathe in, breathe out, and let's meet Ferdinand VII. Ferdinand was born in 1784 at El Escorial, a palace so gray and imposing it could put a canary to sleep. He was the eldest son of Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma, which sounds glamorous until you realize their court was dominated by Manuel Godoy, the king's favorite minister, a man Ferdinand disliked from almost the moment he could form opinions. His childhood was royal but rigid. Religious instruction, etiquette, a sprinkling of languages, and an early mastery of looking mildly displeased. He had a reserved personality, which is polite historian speak, for he didn't smile much. By his teens, Ferdinand was already suspicious of anyone with influence, particularly Godoy. This distrust would later fuel his first real attempt at power, but for now, his youth was a steady rotation of ceremonies, mass, and dinners where the main course was awkward silence. If you're starting to feel sleepy, you're right on track. In 1808, Spain was in turmoil. Discontent with Godoy and Charles IV boiled over, and Ferdinand was pushed forward as the alternative. Charles abdicated, and Ferdinand VII was declared king. For about 6 weeks, he enjoyed the throne, a sort of trial period in monarchy with no refunds. Then Napoleon Bonaparte intervened. Summoning Ferdinand and his father to Bayonne, Napoleon persuaded or pressured them to give up their claims. He handed the Spanish crown to his brother Joseph and sent Ferdinand to comfortable captivity in France. Thus began 6 years of polite exile at the Chateau of Valenciennes. Ferdinand hunted, read, and wrote letters while the Peninsular War raged back home. It was a bit like being locked in a very nice hotel while your house burns down. Inconvenient, but with excellent wine service. In 1814, Napoleon's defeat meant Ferdinand could return. The Spanish people, weary of foreign rule, welcomed him as the desired. Liberal politicians, flush with victory, presented him with the Constitution of 1812, a document promising constitutional monarchy and reform. Ferdinand read it, frowned, and abolished it almost immediately. Absolute monarchy was back. The Inquisition flickered to life again. Dissenters found themselves imprisoned or exiled. It was as if the last 6 years had been a bad dream he was determined to forget, along with everyone else's hopes. For the next several years, Spain bled resources. Its colonies in the Americas, inspired by revolutionary ideals, declared independence one by one. Ferdinand did little to stop them, preferring to maintain tight control at home rather than chase faraway revolutions. If you're starting to drift, don't worry. So did half his ministers. In 1820, a military uprising forced Ferdinand to reinstate the Constitution of 1812. For 3 years, known as the Liberal Triennium, he appeared to accept constitutional limits. In reality, he quietly worked to undermine them, appealing to foreign monarchs for help. He was like a man agreeing to a diet while secretly stockpiling cake. During this time, the press enjoyed brief freedom. Reforms were introduced, and the political climate warmed slightly. But Ferdinand never adjusted to sharing power. For him, it was an interlude, a pause in the program before returning to the main feature, absolute rule. In 1823, Ferdinand's patience paid off. The Holy Alliance, specifically France, sent the 100,000 sons of St. Louis to restore his full powers. They met little resistance. Once back in charge, Ferdinand reinstated censorship, dissolved the liberal government, and resumed his steady, methodical repression. Opposition was not crushed with fire and fury, but with the slow suffocation of bureaucracy. Meanwhile, Spain's overseas empire shrank to a few remaining possessions: Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. The rest slipped away like sand through an unhurried hand. Ferdinand married 4 times, with varying degrees of political calculation. For years he produced no surviving heir, leaving his reactionary brother Don Carlos as the likely successor. Carlos's supporters, the Carlists, saw him as the defender of old-school absolutism, even more rigid than Ferdinand himself. Then, in 1829, Ferdinand married Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies, who unexpectedly gave birth to a daughter, Isabella. In 1830, Ferdinand issued the Pragmatic Sanction, allowing her to inherit the throne despite existing succession laws favoring males. This decision enraged the Carlists and set the stage for decades of civil conflict. It was, perhaps, the most consequential decision of his reign, and he made it late, reluctantly, and in a way that pleased almost no one. By the early 1830s, Ferdinand's health was failing. Gout, obesity, and general frailty limited his movements, but not his paperwork. Even in illness, he insisted on reviewing documents, as if the empire's stability depended on his personal inspection of every memo. He grew increasingly paranoid, surrounded by factions vying for influence over the succession. His final years were marked by tension and a creeping sense that the monarchy's foundations were eroding, not in a dramatic collapse, but in the slow way an old building quietly settles into the ground. Ferdinand died in 1833, leaving the throne to his 3-year-old daughter, Isabella II, under the regency of Maria Cristina. Almost immediately, Spain descended into the First Carlist War, the direct result of Ferdinand's belated succession decision. Ferdinand V is remembered less for what he built than for what he dismantled. He began his reign with widespread public goodwill and ended it with a country poorer, more divided, and politically stagnant. He was not a flamboyant tyrant or a great reformer. He was, instead, a ruler of reversals, a man whose reign was a long exercise in putting the brakes on history. For the sleepless, his life is a comfort, proof that even in turbulent times, some leaders can make every event feel like it's happening in slow motion. From Calm Countdown, thank you for joining us in this soft focused look at one of Europe's most methodical monarchs. Breathe deeply, let the tension go, and if you're not asleep yet, you probably will be before the next king. Next on our countdown at number 7 comes a king whose reign was less a chapter in history and more a brief footnote. Edward VIII of Great Britain and Ireland. Welcome back to Calm Countdown, the series that turns history's most dramatic moments into a soft, slow lullaby for your overworked mind. Tonight, we have a monarch who was never crowned, a ruler whose reign lasted just 326 days, and a man who managed to turn one of the most constitutionally stable monarchies in the world into an awkward family meeting. This is Edward VIII, the king who walked away from the job, crown and all, for love, or at least for someone who could keep him entertained at parties. Edward's story is often told as a great romantic sacrifice, a man giving up a throne for the woman he loved. But if you look closely, you'll find less of a Shakespearean tragedy and more of an office worker realizing the job isn't what he thought it would be and handing in his resignation before the probation period ended. So, get comfortable, let your breathing slow, and follow along as we glide through the short, hesitant reign of Edward VIII. Spoiler, will be done before the kettle boils that Edward was born in 1894, the eldest son of the future George V and Queen Mary, as the heir apparent. He was groomed for kingship from the start. Military training, royal etiquette, public duties, and the delicate art of looking serious while unveiling plaques. He served during World War I, though not in frontline combat. His charm and good looks made him popular, but there were already whispers in the corridors of Buckingham Palace that he lacked the gravitas for the throne. Edward loved travel, parties, and fashionable friends. He seemed happiest abroad or on holiday, not in the heavy-lidded world of government dispatches and state functions. Still, he was a crowd pleaser, which was enough for now. As Prince of Wales, Edward became a global celebrity. He toured the empire, appeared in films and photographs, and cultivated an image that mixed royal dignity with just enough modern flair to keep the newspapers interested. Behind the scenes, though he resisted the routines of royal duty, he preferred private retreats, social gatherings, and the company of people outside the rigid aristocratic circle. Among these acquaintances was Wallis Simpson, an American socialite who would become the defining figure of his life. Wallis was witty, fashionable, and twice divorced, which in the 1930s was not considered ideal resume material for a potential queen. But Edward was smitten, and their relationship deepened through the latter years of his father's reign. In January 1936, George V died, and Edward became king. From the start, he seemed slightly uncomfortable in the role, as if the crown had been placed on his head while he was in the middle of telling a joke. He approached monarchy in his own way, more informal, less bound by tradition, and more willing to speak directly to the public. Some found this refreshing. Others found it alarming. Politicians quickly noticed that Edward was far more interested in his personal life than in mastering the constitutional nuances of his office. Edward's relationship with Wallis Simpson soon became a political crisis. As head of the Church of England, he could not marry a divorced woman whose former spouses were still living. The British government, the Dominions, and the Church all opposed the idea. Edward was given a choice: end the relationship or give up the throne. For months, he stalled, hoping for some compromise that never came. By December, the standoff reached its end. Edward announced his abdication in a calm radio broadcast, declaring that he could not carry out his duties without the help and support of the woman I loved. It was, perhaps, the most famous resignation letter in British history, in one of the shortest reigns of any English monarch. After the abdication, Edward was given the title Duke of Windsor and promptly married Wallis Simpson in France. The couple spent much of their life abroad, alternating between high society gatherings and quieter retreats. They never returned to live permanently in Britain, and Edward's role in public life diminished to occasional ceremonial appearances. For decades, they moved between Europe and the United States, drifting through parties, receptions, and comfortable hotels. During World War II, Edward served briefly as governor of the Bahamas, a role that kept him far from the main theaters of conflict. He was never fully trusted by the British government, partly due to perceived sympathies with Germany before the war. In the Bahamas, he applied himself with a light touch, attending functions, inspecting small-scale projects, and generally maintaining the same relaxed pace that had defined his life since abdication. After the war, Edward and Wallis returned to Europe. Their later decades were spent largely in Paris, where they hosted gatherings, attended fashion shows, and gave occasional interviews that hinted at mild regret but no deep reflection. Edward remained estranged from much of the royal family, though he occasionally visited for formal events. His life was comfortable, if uneventful, the kind of long, slow afternoon that might send a restless historian gently to sleep. Edward died in 1972 in Paris, after years of declining health. Wallis survived him by 14 years, living quietly and rarely appearing in public. In the end, Edward's reign is remembered not for policy or reform, but for a personal choice, one that defined him far more than any act of governance. Edward VIII remains a curiosity in British history, a king who walked away, not under pressure of revolution or invasion, but because he preferred life on his own terms. He left behind no grand speeches, no landmark reforms, no decisive acts of leadership, just the faint impression of a man who tried the job of king and decided it wasn't for him. For those lying awake tonight, wondering if they've chosen the right path in life, take comfort. Even kings sometimes decide they're better off somewhere else. From Calm Countdown, thank you for letting Edward's Gentle abdication guide you toward rest. May your choices be peaceful, your duties light, and your evenings pleasantly uneventful. Next on our countdown at number 6 is a ruler who commanded one of the largest empires the world has ever seen, and still managed to make it feel like an endless boardroom meeting. Introducing Charles I of Austria, the king who arrived too late. Welcome back to Calm Countdown, the series that tucks history in under a heavy quilt and lets the past drift quietly off to sleep. Tonight's subject is the last ruler of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a man who inherited a fading realm, already halfway out the door, and spent his short reign politely rearranging the furniture before the building collapsed. This is Charles I of Austria, also known as Charles IV of Hungary, for those keeping score at home, but really, he could be called Charles the Last. He came to power in 1916, in the middle of the First World War, and left it all behind just 2 years later, when his empire dissolved around him. There are no great victories here, no decisive speeches, no lasting reforms. What we have is the story of a man who stepped into history's spotlight at exactly the wrong time and then stood there awkwardly until the curtain came down. So let's take a deep breath, slow our thoughts, and ease into the gentle anti-drama of Charles I. Born in 1887 at Persenbug Castle, Charles was never expected to be emperor. He was a great-nephew of the reigning Franz Joseph I, several places down the line of succession. This meant a childhood of privilege, but without the heavy weight of expectation. He was educated in military schools, learned multiple languages, and developed a courteous, almost shy manner. He loved horses, enjoyed quiet family life, and showed little appetite for political intrigue, qualities that made him likable but hardly prepared him for navigating a collapsing multi-ethnic empire. For most of his youth, he occupied the comfortable position of a royal who could attend ceremonies, without ever imagining he might have to run the whole show. History, however, had other plans. The chain of events that brought Charles to the throne was abrupt and tragic. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 thrust Charles into the role of heir presumptive. 2 years later, Emperor Franz Joseph died at the age of 86, and the young Charles, just 29 years old, suddenly found himself ruling a warring, fractured empire. He had barely settled into the emperor's seat when he realized the empire's military situation was dire, the economy was faltering, and the various nationalities within the Austro-Hungarian realm were pulling in opposite directions. If history were a drama, this would be the moment for bold action. But Charles's reign would be defined by something else. Cautious, well-meaning attempts that changed little and convinced few. From the start, Charles sought an end to the First World War. He believed the empire's survival depended on peace, and he opened secret negotiations through his brother-in-law, Prince Sixtus of Bourbon-Parma, known as the Sixtus Affair. These back-channel talks with the Allies were meant to secure a separate peace for Austria. But when word of the negotiations leaked in 1918, it damaged relations with Germany, Austria's key ally, and left Charles politically weakened. He was caught between two impossible positions. Staying in the war meant further ruin. Leaving it meant alienating Germany and facing potential occupation. In the end, Austria-Hungary stayed in the war, but with dwindling resources, falling morale, and growing internal unrest. At home, Charles faced the challenge of ruling over an empire made up of many ethnic groups: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, Poles, and Italians, each with their own national aspirations. Charles attempted modest reforms, including proposals for federalization, but these came too late. By 1918, nationalist movements were declaring independence faster than Vienna could respond. It was the political equivalent of trying to patch a leaking boat with a teaspoon. You might slow the water for a moment, but the outcome is inevitable, and just as soporific to watch. In October 1918, as the war drew to a close, the empire began to unravel. One by one, its constituent nations declared independence. By November, Austria-Hungary was gone. Charles issued a statement relinquishing participation in state affairs, but he never formally abdicated, holding on to the title of emperor in name, if not in power. He withdrew from Vienna, first to Switzerland, then into a series of polite exiles. It was the softest of exits. No executions, no palace stormings, just a quiet departure into the Alps. In 1921, Charles made 2 unsuccessful attempts to reclaim the Hungarian throne. Both were clumsy affairs, lacking broad support. Regent Mikkel Horthy politely but firmly resisted Charles's return, and international pressure sealed the matter. After the second attempt, Charles was taken into custody and exiled to the Portuguese island of Madeira. It was the kind of punishment that comes with ocean views and gentle breezes, hardly the stuff of revolutionary legends. Charles lived modestly on Madeira with his wife, Empress Zita, and their children. He devoted his time to family, religion, and the occasional hope of restoration. His health, however, declined in the island's damp climate in 1922. He contracted pneumonia and died at the age of 34. His short life had spanned the last years of a centuries-old empire, 2 failed restoration attempts, and an exit from politics so understated it almost went unnoticed. Charles I remains a footnote in the grand sweep of European history. He was a decent man, personally popular with those who knew him, but unable to halt the disintegration of his empire. His reign was brief, his policies tentative, and his legacy muted. For the sleep-deprived listener, he offers the comforting reminder that not every historical figure is a whirlwind of action. Some are more like a gentle breeze present, but unlikely to disturb your rest. From Calm Countdown, thank you for letting Charles's quiet reign ease you toward the end of your day. Let the old maps fade, let the empires dissolve, and let the past drift peacefully into the background. Next, at number 4 in our list of the 10 most boring kings in history, is one of the most magnificently unremarkable rulers. It's the Bourbon who came back without bringing much excitement with him. Louis XVIII of France. Welcome back to Calm Countdown, where history's least thrilling rulers get their long, slow moment in the spotlight. Perfect for drifting into that peaceful pre-sleep haze. Tonight, we arrive at the 4th most boring king in our ongoing list of history's most magnificently unremarkable monarchs, Louis XVIII of France. He's the man who brought the Bourbon dynasty back to power after Napoleon's dramatic run, but without any of the drama himself. Louis's reign was less about conquering continents and more about attending meetings, restoring furniture, and quietly trying to convince a nation that monarchy was still worth having. While Napoleon was all cannons and cavalry charges, Louis was more quills and committee reports. If the French Revolution was a storm, and Napoleon was the lightning, then Louis was the calm drizzle that followed, the sort of weather you barely notice as you go about your day. So, take a deep breath, let your shoulders drop, and prepare to wander slowly through the lukewarm. Restoration of Louis XVIII. Louis was born in 1755. The younger brother of the future, Louis XVI. As a royal prince, he enjoyed the usual mix of luxury, etiquette, and a careful education in statecraft. But he wasn't expected to become king himself, at least not until the French Revolution had other ideas. He earned a reputation for being intelligent, well-read, and a touch sarcastic, but not particularly inclined toward bold action. Even in youth, he preferred measured discussion over heated confrontation, a quality that would later define his entire political career. When the revolution broke out in 1789, Louis fled France, beginning an exile that would last over 2 decades. He traveled between European courts, trying to drum up support for restoring the monarchy, while his brother, Louis XVI, met a grim end at the guillotine. Louis XVIII kept his head literally and figuratively by staying far from the action. He issued declarations, wrote letters, and maintained the outward dignity of a king in waiting, but always at a safe distance from any actual fighting. For much of his exile, he lived in relative comfort, enjoying good food, cultured conversation, and the occasional quiet hope that one day France might invite him back. That day came in 1814. When Napoleon was forced to abdicate after years of continental warfare, the victorious Allies restored Louis to the throne, making him the first Bourbon king of France in over 20 years. But Louis understood. He was not returning to the France of his youth. The Revolution and Napoleon had changed the country forever. So, in a rare act of royal pragmatism, he accepted a constitutional monarchy under the Charter of 1814, allowing for a parliament, some civil liberties, and a modest nod to the new political reality. It wasn't bold, it wasn't sweeping, but it was cautious, and it worked. For a time, in 1815, Napoleon escaped exile on Elba and reclaimed power for the famous 100 Days. Louis, ever the pragmatist, fled to Belgium without much fuss. When Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo a few months later, Louis returned again to Paris. If Napoleon's comeback was a roaring fire, Louis's return was more like someone quietly switching the lights. Back on after a brief power cut, the rest of Louis's reign was devoted to restoring stability and balancing the competing demands of royalists who wanted to return to the old ways and liberals who preferred Napoleon's reforms. He re-established the Catholic Church's position, compensated immigrants whose property had been confiscated, and carefully navigated between factions. His government avoided grand gestures in favor of incremental adjustments, which was exactly his style. It was a reign of small, steady steps rather than leaps, ideal for putting the country back together, and ideal, frankly, for helping you drift gently toward sleep. Louis was no warrior king. He was overweight, gout-ridden, and moved with the deliberate pace of a man in no hurry. His court was less about glittering balls and more about well-ordered dinners, polite conversation, and a quiet game of cards. He valued diplomacy over force, paperwork over sabers. He believed in the monarchy, but he believed just as strongly in keeping it safe by avoiding unnecessary risks, a philosophy that, while dull, may have saved the Bourbon dynasty from collapsing immediately. Louis ruled until his death in 1824, passing the crown to his brother, Charles X. He left France relatively stable, not thriving, not transformed, but calm enough to carry on. His passing was marked by the usual formalities, but few tears. He had been a steady presence, but not a deeply loved one. Louis XVIII's THS reign was the political equivalent of a lukewarm bath. Nothing too hot, nothing too cold, just tepid enough to be tolerable. He is remembered when he's remembered, at all as the king who brought the monarchy back without setting the country on fire. No heroics, no disasters, just a quiet middle path. So, if Napoleon kept historians awake at night, Louis XVIII is here to help them nod off again. From Calm Countdown, thank you for joining us as we tick another name off our list of histories. Most magnificently unremarkable monarchs. Next time, we move one step closer to the crown of boredom itself. Until then, let your thoughts settle, and let the past fade gently into silence. That brings us to number 4 in our countdown. A monarch who ruled Britain without ever quite moving in. Introducing George I of Great Britain and Ireland, and the king who barely spoke English. Welcome back to Calm Countdown, where monarchs aren't measured by their conquests or charisma, but by their uncanny ability to blend into the wallpaper of history. Tonight, we meet the 4th most boring king in our ongoing journey through the sleepiest thrones in history, George I of Great Britain, a man who reigned for 13 years without ever learning much English, rarely smiling in public, and spending more time in his beloved Hanover than in the kingdom he technically ruled. If you've ever had a job you didn't really want but couldn't quite refuse, you may understand George's reign. He was the original reluctant monarch, the sort who could attend an official ceremony and still look like he was thinking about what to have for lunch. So, settle in, let your breathing find a gentle rhythm, and prepare for the slow, steady reign of a king whose greatest political achievement may have been perfecting the art of politely avoiding conversations. George was born in 1660 in Hanover, a small German state. His upbringing was that of a minor German prince, educated in court etiquette, trained in military matters, and firmly rooted in the politics of the Holy Roman Empire. There was nothing in his early life to suggest he'd one day become King of Great Britain. His focus was local, his ambitions modest, and his worldview shaped by the slow-moving pace of German court life. Thanks to the tangled family tree of European royalty, George became heir to the British throne through the Act of Settlement 1701, which ensured a Protestant succession. He was a distant cousin of Queen Anne, but with the inconvenient advantage of being Protestant in a royal family full of Catholics. When Queen Anne died in 1714 without surviving heirs, George was invited to take the crown. He accepted, though whether out of enthusiasm or a polite sense of duty is still up for debate. George arrived in Britain speaking little to no English, and he never made much effort to master it. His court functioned in German with translators, smoothing over conversations with ministers and courtiers. This linguistic barrier kept him at a polite distance from his subjects. Public appearances were formal but muted, and he rarely engaged in speeches or displays of charm. The result, a monarchy that felt aloof, if not outright detached. George was not a hands-on ruler. Much of the actual governance was handled by his ministers, particularly Sir Robert Walpole, who became Britain's first de facto prime minister during George's reign. The king's main political contribution was allowing this system to function without too much interference. It wasn't inspiring, but it set the stage for the modern constitutional monarchy, a slow evolution that happened almost by accident. Despite wearing the British crown, George's heart, and often his physical presence, remained in Hanover. He visited frequently, sometimes for months at a time, leaving Britain in the capable, if uninspired, hands of his ministers. This dual loyalty frustrated many in Britain, who saw their king as a part-time resident. But George saw no reason to change. After all, Hanover was home. For all his detachment, George's reign was relatively stable. There were no major wars on British soil, no revolutions, and only a few mild political crises. Even his personal life, while not entirely without intrigue, including rumors of strained relations with his son, the future George II, was free of the sort of headline-grabbing drama that keeps historians awake at night. George died in 1727 while traveling to Hanover. Fittingly, he passed away in the land he loved most, not in the country he ruled. His body was returned to Hanover for burial, a final reminder of where his loyalties truly lay. George I's reign may not sparkle with heroics or innovation, but it quietly shaped the role of the monarchy in Britain. By stepping back, he allowed Parliament and ministers to take the lead, creating a system that still functions today. It was monarchy by absence, and in its own way, it worked. For the weary listener tonight, George offers the reassurance that sometimes doing less really is doing enough. From Calm Countdown, thank you for joining us as we check off another name on our journey to crown the most boring king in history. Next time, we inch closer to the ultimate royal. That brings us to the third most boring king in history. Here we have the king who barely had time to find the bathroom before losing his crown. Introducing Umberto II of Italy, the king who barely had time to sit down on his throne. Welcome back to Calm Countdown, where history's monarchs are ranked not by their glory, but by their ability to inspire a slow, contented yawn. Tonight, we arrive at the third most boring king in our ongoing list. Umberto II of Italy, the man whose reign was so brief that he's sometimes called the May King. His time on the throne lasted just over a month in 1946, shorter than some people's summer holidays. Umberto didn't preside over grand battles or sweeping reforms. Instead, his reign was more of an extended waiting room appointment, the kind where you're not sure if anything is actually happening. By the time you look up, it's over, and no one's quite sure what was decided. So, let's take a long breath, unclench our jaws, and stroll through the fleeting, whisper-quiet reign of Italy's last king. Umberto was born in 1904, the son of King Victor Emmanuel III. From birth, he was groomed for kingship. Military training, formal education, and the occasional ceremonial appearance by his father's side, he had the polished manners of a prince in the clean-cut image that looked good in the newspapers. but his personality was more reserved than magnetic. Even friends described him as polite to the point of invisibility. By the 1930s and 40s, Umberto's father was king during Benito Mussolini's fascist regime. The monarchy became increasingly sidelined as Mussolini consolidated power. Umberto, as heir apparent, mostly observed from the sidelines, making ceremonial appearances and commanding military units with little real influence. When World War II turned against Italy, the monarchy's fortunes plummeted. Mussolini was removed from power in 1943, but the damage to the royal family's reputation was already deep. In May 1946, as Italy prepared for a referendum on whether to keep the monarchy, Victor Emmanuel III abdicated in favor of his son. Hoping a fresh face might sway public opinion, Umberto became king, but with the referendum scheduled just weeks later, his reign was essentially a trial period. He spent the month making speeches, traveling the country, and projecting a modern, democratic image. It wasn't enough. On June 2nd, Italians voted to abolish the monarchy, and by June 12th, Umberto was in exile. Umberto moved to Portugal, where he lived for the next 37 years. His life abroad was peaceful, dignified, and almost entirely devoid of controversy. He attended occasional royal functions, gave polite interviews, and remained a figure of mild curiosity for monarchists, but he never attempted a political comeback. Instead, he devoted himself to family, charitable work, and the small routines of a comfortable, if uneventful, life. Even his opponents conceded that Umberto had personal integrity. He was known for his courtesy, his composure, and his avoidance of the kind of scandals that often follow exiled royalty. But history tends to overlook kings, who neither win great victories nor cause great disasters. Umberto's reign was too short to achieve much, and his long exile too uneventful to leave a deep imprint. Umberto died in 1983 in Geneva, still in exile. His remains were interred in Holcombe Abbey in France, alongside other members of the House of Savoy. In Italy, memories of his reign are faint, overshadowed by the dramatic political shifts of the post-war era. He is remembered, if at all, as the king who barely had time to warm the throne. Umberto II's reign is a study in brevity, a monarch's career measured not in years, but in weeks. His short time on the throne, his graceful acceptance of exile, and his unremarkable later life all place him firmly near the top of our boredom countdown. For listeners drifting off tonight, Umberto offers a gentle lesson. Sometimes, the best way to avoid disaster is to do very little, very politely, and for as short a time as possible. From Calm Countdown, thank you for joining us as we prepare to crown the most boring king in history. Only one name remains, so stay tuned for the royal yawn to end all yawns. And now, the penultimate king in our list of the 10 most boring monarchs in history. Sitting comfortably at number 2, a ruler who is remembered more for a single piece of parchment than for any actual achievement, John of England. Welcome back to Calm Countdown, where we slowly stroll through the annals of history's most magnificently unremarkable monarchs. Tonight's subject, King John, is best known for signing the Magna Carta in 1215, not because he wanted to, but because a bunch of annoyed barons basically made him. John's reign was a masterclass in losing things, lands, money, allies, and the patience of his own subjects. But he didn't lose them in some dramatic blaze of glory. No, this was more of a slow, bureaucratic mismanagement, the kind of steady downward slide that makes historians sigh and listeners gently doze off. So, take a deep breath, let your shoulders sink, and prepare for the reign of a king who somehow turned England into a medieval customer service complaint line. John was born in 1166, the youngest son of King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, with multiple older brothers ahead of him. John was never expected to rule, which might explain why he didn't seem especially prepared when the job eventually fell to him. Nicknamed Lachlan in his youth because he inherited no major territories, John was the royal family's extra piece, useful to have around, but not part of the main set. Through a combination of untimely deaths and his own relentless survival, John became king in 1199 after the death of his brother, Richard the Lion, where Richard had been a warrior king, leading armies in the Crusades. John's skill set leaned more toward, let's say, administrative oversight. He preferred paperwork to battlefields, negotiations to sieges, and seemed to treat ruling more like managing a very large, underperforming estate. One of John's early challenges was holding on to England's territories in France, and he failed spectacularly. His disputes with the French king, Philip II, spiraled into open conflict. Instead of clever strategy or bold military maneuvers, John's campaigns were marked by delays, underfunding, and occasional baffling decisions. By 1204, he'd lost Normandy entirely, along with much of England's French holdings. This loss was more than a military failure. It was a hit to England's prestige, and to John's already lukewarm popularity. To pay for his attempts to reclaim lost lands, John raised taxes. Then he raised them again, and again. His heavy-handed approach, combined with arbitrary fines and legal abuses, alienated both the nobility and the common people. John wasn't tyrannical in the cinematic sense. No fiery speeches or public executions. For show, just consistently irritating, like a slow leak in the roof you can't quite fix. By 1215, England's barons had had enough. They rebelled, forcing John into negotiations that resulted in the Magna Carta, a charter of rights that limited the king's power. John signed it at Runnymede, looking for all the world like a man reluctantly agreeing to terms and conditions, just to get the pop-up window off his screen. While the Magna Carta is celebrated today as a foundation of constitutional government, John immediately tried to wriggle out of it, appealing to the Pope to have it annulled. The whole thing dissolved into a civil war, known as the First Barons' War, which, true to form, dragged on without much decisive action from John himself. Contemporaries described John as suspicious, petty, and prone to sudden bursts of temper, but also intelligent and capable when he put in the effort. Unfortunately, capable when he bothered is not the most inspiring royal legacy. He had a knack for alienating allies and a tendency to take the short-term view, often at the expense of long-term stability. His reign is remembered less for vision and more for damage control, and even then, the control part is debatable. John's reign ended not with a dramatic battlefield defeat, but with illness. In 1216, while campaigning in eastern England, he contracted dysentery and died at Newark Castle. He was buried in Worcester Cathedral, leaving the crown to his 9-year-old son, Henry III. The barons promptly made peace, and England moved on. John of England is a rare case in royal history, a king famous for something he didn't really want to do. His unwilling role in creating the Magna Carta has kept his name alive, but the rest of his reign is a slow drift of losses, grudges, and grudging compromises. For the purposes of our countdown, he's an ideal candidate for the number 2 spot. A king who could drain the excitement from a rebellion, flatten the drama of a power struggle, and sign away his authority without so much as a raised eyebrow. From Calm Countdown, thank you for joining us as we take one last sleepy step toward the crown of boredom itself. Up next, the undisputed champion of uneventfulness, the most boring king in history, William IV of the United Kingdom. And finally, the moment we've been sleepily building toward, the number 1 most boring king in history, William IV of Great Britain and Ireland. Welcome back to Calm Countdown, where crowns weigh heavy, events move slowly, and monarchs gently fade into the historical wallpaper. Tonight, we reach the most boring king in our entire list, the undisputed champion of mildness, William IV of the United Kingdom. Known as the Sailor King for his time in the Royal Navy, William managed to spend 7 years on the throne without stirring much excitement. His reign bridged the gap between 2 far more famous queens, George IV's flamboyant niece, Victoria, and his own predecessor's high society spectacle, making him a sort of transitional monarch. If this were a fireworks show, William would be the pause between the big bursts, steady, serviceable, and easy to miss if you look away for a moment. So, as we close our royal slumber countdown, let your breathing slow, your mind drift, and prepare for a calm sail through the reign of William IV. Born in 1765, William was the third son of King George III, with two older brothers ahead of him. No one expected him to inherit the throne. His youth was relatively relaxed, free from the intense preparation faced by direct heirs. At 13, he joined the Royal Navy, serving in North America and the Caribbean. He rose to the rank of admiral, earning the Sailor King nickname long before he became king. Naval life suited him, structured, practical, and far from the stiff rituals of court. For decades, William lived in semi-retirement from public life, holding various ceremonial naval positions. He maintained a long relationship with the actress, Dorothea Jordan, with whom he had 10 illegitimate children. Despite their separation in later years, William remained fond of her and provided for their children. When his elder brothers died without legitimate heirs, William suddenly found himself in the unexpected position of heir presumptive to the throne. William became king in 1830 at the age of 64, making him the oldest person ever to ascend the British throne at that time. His coronation was notably frugal compared to previous monarchs. Costing, far less than George IV's extravagant ceremony. His approach to kingship was practical and understated. He had no interest in pomp for pomp's sake, preferring efficiency and directness. This endeared him to some, baffled others, and left little for history to romanticize. William's reign saw the passage of the Reform Act 1832, which expanded voting rights and restructured parliamentary representation. While this was a landmark in British politics, William himself played a cautious, mostly reactive role, signing the bill after it became clear that resistance would cause more trouble than it was worth. He also presided over the abolition of slavery in most of the British Empire in 1833, another historic moment that, while significant, was largely driven by Parliament rather than the king himself. Despite his lack of political drama, William was known for his informality. He would walk around London without a large entourage, greet strangers, and dispense with some of the stricter court protocols. This made him approachable, but didn't exactly cement him in the public imagination as a legendary figure. His court was quieter, less indulgent, and far less scandal-prone than his predecessors, which suited him just fine, though it left historians with fewer colorful anecdotes. William had no legitimate surviving children, so the crown passed to his niece, Queen Victoria. Upon his death in 1837, he took a protective interest in her upbringing, reportedly trying to ensure she would be prepared for the throne without being overly influenced by her mother's advisors. This transition marked the end of his reign and the start of one of the most famous in British history, a historical juxtaposition that only emphasizes William's comparative dullness. William died at Windsor Castle at the age of 71. His funeral was dignified but modest, reflecting his personal tastes. In the history books, he remains a steady but unremarkable monarch, the sort who quietly keeps the ship afloat until someone more dynamic arrives, as the most boring king in our countdown. William IV holds a peculiar kind of honor. He ruled without chaos, scandal, or grandstanding. His reign may not inspire epic films or stirring ballads, but it offers a gentle reassurance that sometimes the best service a monarch can provide is to avoid making waves. And with that, our calm countdown of history's most magnificent, unremarkable kings comes to a close. Thank you for joining us on this slow, steady journey. May your thoughts drift away as quietly as William's reign faded into the reign of Queen Victoria. And that concludes our royal roll call of yawns. We've met kings who built empires of paperwork, waged wars at the pace of a damp sponge, and navigated diplomacy with all the flair of a mildly apologetic shop clerk. If history teaches us anything, it's that not every ruler leaves a blazing legacy. Some simply pass through the centuries like a faint draft under a door, present but hardly noticed. If you enjoyed this gentle wander through the least thrilling corridors of history, don't forget to subscribe. It helps us keep producing these perfectly underpowered countdowns. Click the bell so you'll be alerted the moment we release another topic that somehow manages to be both educational and deeply SOPORIFIC. And if you have a suggestion for the next theme, whether it's more historical dens, quietly pointless inventions, or anything else that puts you in the right frame of mind for sleep, leave it in the comments. From all of us at Calm Countdown, thank you for watching. And may your dreams be just slightly more exciting than the reigns we've discussed tonight.